Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin Daf Kaf Hey. Today's stuff is sponsored by Alana and Daniel Storch in honor of Patty Evans on her milestone birthday. We cherish you as a truly dear and special friend. May Hashem grant you a fullness of years filled with health, happiness, love, and continued bracha. May this year bring you much nachat, joy, and with beautiful moments with all those who love you. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. We're continuing in this list of comparison of items. So we're in the middle of discussing, and today we're going to have two Mishnayot about vessels and different kinds of vessels. We were discussing vessels that are earthenware vessels and vessels that are not earthenware vessels. And we discussed, I brought for a bit of show and tell today. We have a mug, which I'm going to call my earthenware vessel, a ceramic mug. Exactly earthenware, but we'll call it an earthenware vessel. And then we have my Kiddush cup. Now you'll notice my Kiddush cup is taller than my mug, and that's on purpose. We're gonna get back to that in a later detail. We have time for that. But what we discussed until now is the earthenware vessel. As soon as a sheretz falls into the airspace, that's going to make the vessel impure. And even if there's food in the airspace and the vessel is already impure, then the food is going to be impure. Okay, we'll talk about what exactly that means. Food in the airspace, you don't usually have food hanging down. Whereas you can have a sheretz that kind of, the food on its way down into the vessel before it touches it. Also, that would be case where it's in the air. And then if it's something, the sheretz touches something outside the vessel, the wall on the outside, that actually isn't impure. With the earthenware, with the metal or other kind of vessels, we said it's the exact opposite. Things are only impure if they touch, which means either inside or outside. But the point is that on the outside, it touches the outside, it's actually going to be impure, which is different from the clarifies, which isn't. And if it just goes into the airspace inside but doesn't yet touch the vessel, it's not going to be impure. So we were in the middle of a braita, and the braita was trying to compare, it was trying to say, where do we get the fact that tocho, even if it doesn't touch? How do we know the sheretz is going to make the kli impure? I just want to remind you again, a sheretz is called an avatuma, like a father of tuma. It means like a higher level of impurity. It creates, the vessel will become a rishon, which is a first degree impurity, and that will have the power to make only food and drink, but any food and drink that comes in that vessel will now be impure. That will become a sheni l'tuma. Just so you remember how that's a second degree impurity. That's how tuma works. So, the braita said, I'm going to start from the braita that says Menahane Mile, about 6 lines from the bottom of the daf. Tocho, apal pi shelo naga. So even if the sheretz doesn't touch the vessel, I should have brought one of those pretend cockroaches. But anyway, so, sorry I didn't think that far. But we definitely have some of those around the house. So if you start lowering that dead creature into the vessel, then even if it doesn't touch, it's going to be impure. So now they say, how do you know? Maybe it actually does have to touch. So Rabbi Yonasan ben Uvtumas explains, he uses Gzera Shava. Remember this, we're going to mention it back in a little bit, further on in our daf. Tocho. It says tocho in the pasuk twice. If you remember, we read this pasuk. Any kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho. Something falls into it. Kol asher b'tocho, everything in it, right? So the first part is talking about the sheretz, creature falling in. The second part is talking about the food that's inside. So now they're going to make a comparison and say, ma tocho ha'amur litame, just like it can make food that's in here impure, even if it's not touching, which we don't yet know how we know that, but in a second we're going to get there. Af pi shelo naga, af tocho ha'amur litame. So likewise, when the sheretz goes in, af pi shelo naga, even if the sheretz doesn't touch. So now they're going to say, V'hata minalan. How do we know this? So, Amar Rabbi Yonasan, HaTorah ida al kli cheres afilu malei chardal. Chardal are mustard seeds. You see mustard seeds, right? They're little teeny particles. Another way you could think about it is sesame seeds. Imagine if this vessel was filled with sesame seeds and the vessel was impure. Would all the sesame seeds become impure? Of course, because we don't know otherwise, right? Nobody told us that's not the case. It says anything in the vessel will become impure. Now, anything in the vessel, right? Even if you take big things, like let's say it's full of, not this, but let's say a bigger bowl would be full of apples. Not all the apples are going to be touching the bottom of the vessel. Just like in the mustard seeds, many of them are not touching the sides or the bottom of the vessel. And yet they're going to be deemed impure. So what do you see? That's why I said before, we'll see. What does it mean to be in the airspace? When we talk about the sheretz, what we mean is as soon as it passes this top level, right, and it's within the airspace, it goes just below the top of the walls of the vessel, it will become impure. The food, we can view it from the bottom, right? If food goes in there and some of it's at the top of the pile and it's not touching any part, it's still going to be impure. So that's how we know. They're sort of saying it's just obvious that when there's food in there, not all the food's going to be touching the sides or won't necessarily. And yet anything, it says, kol asher b'tocho, right? Everything inside it is impure, whether or not it's touching. And then we're going to make a gzera shava back to the sheretz, even if it's not touching. Yes, we're talking about a dead sheretz, just to be clear. Only dead shretzim are impure. And there's shmona shretzim. There's 8 specific shretzim that have impurity, okay? It's not every single creepy crawly creature. It's certain ones, the 8 listed in the Torah, that carry impurity. Amar le Rav Ada bar Ahava le Rava. So now we're going to go with our questions. Yeh kli cheres metamei miggabbo mikav chomer. Okay, this time it's not a braita. We had a braita already, but this time Rav Ada bar Ahava is asking Rava, why don't we make a kav chomer like we did in the other ones? Why don't we say that a kli cheres is going to be metame if something touches the outside, the whole kli will be impure, based on a kav chomer from the other vessels. Because, why? Let's just say simply, kli cheres has a chumrah. If the airspace already, right, the sheretz falls into the airspace without even touching the vessel, it's going to make it impure. Then it shows it's more stringent than other vessels. So why don't we say the stringency of the other vessels would apply to here as well? So ma kol hakelim she'em mitamim me'avira mitamim migaban. All other vessels are not tamei in this airspace. If it just goes into the airspace, they're not. Only if it touches it, okay, and they are mitamei on the outside if it touches it. Kli cheres shemitamei me'aviro eno din she'tamei miggabbo. So the kli cheres, which has this unique kind of toma, wouldn't you think would have the basic kind of impurity that even if it touches the outside, it should be impure? To which they answer, Amar Kra, like we know already, every time we're going to have a special pasuk to teach. No. B'chol kli patuach asher ein samid patil alav. This says any vessel that's open, which doesn't have a samid patil, is like this way of sealing the vessel, but basically means it's not sealed. And then the next words are tamehu, it will become impure. Okay, but this means if you have this kli patuach, it's open vessel. Here they're talking about tumat mate. If it's in an ohel, it's in a tent, then the kli will become impure and everything in the kli will become impure. That's if it's not covered. Okay, so now the first question is, what kind of kli are we talking about? To prove, is this a kli cheres or is it something else? They're going to say it's obvious they're talking about a kli cheres because ezehu kli shetumato kodemet lepitcho. What kli? What it says here, kol kli patuach, open. Now, first of all, there's a little bit of redundancy in this pasuk. It says any open vessel that doesn't have a seal on it. Well, if it doesn't have a seal, then it's open. So you don't really need to say it's open. So what do you mean it's open? What you mean by open means that the way they say it here, it's a bit of a weird thing to translate literally, but it's a vessel. I'll translate it literally and then I'll tell you what it means. That the tumato, the impurity, kodemet lepitcho, comes first to the petach. Okay, what does that mean? It means that as soon as it gets into the opening of the vessel through the airspace, right? Where does if something goes into this vessel, right? What's it going to do? It's going to go into the vessel and then only later get down to the bottom and touch it. So the first way the impurity comes in, right? It comes already in the entrance. If I took my metal utensil, when I put it in, it doesn't get to the entrance of the vessel. I have to get to the bottom or to the side to touch it before it will become impure. So, meaning if I'm a sheretz, right? The creepy crawler. So they say obviously this patuach is referencing a vessel that's an earthenware vessel because the Rashi says it in the words of the tuma mimaheret lavo lepitcho, like it quickly gets to the entrance, and as soon as it hits the entrance, it's already impure. So that proves we're talking about a kli cheres. Okay, that didn't tell us yet what we're looking for. How do we know then that it's not going to be mitameh on the outside, which is what we're looking for? Because, so first they say, okay, fine. What's the kli shetumato kodem lepitcho? Hevei omer is a kli cheres. That's an earthenware vessel. V'chi ein samid patil alav hu ditamei. Now, what does it tell you? When is it going to become impure? If it doesn't have a cover on it, if it's not sealed. Ha yesh samid patil alav. What if it is completely covered? Then it's not going to become impure. Why not? Because nothing that touches the outside is going to pass on impurity, right? If the sheretz touches the outside, it's not going to be impure. Because if it has a cover, the tumah can't go inside, and that's the only way it's going to become impure. And that's how we learn that it's not going to be impure by something touching the outside of it, because as soon as it's covered and closed, you can't get impurity in there. Now let's go the other way. Why don't we say all the other vessels should be betame from the airspace from a kav hachomer? Because if we now proved that these other vessels have a stringency that, what is it? That even by touching the outside, the whole vessel becomes impure, and that's going to basically mess up things that are inside the vessel, right? If it has food in it, the food will become impure, so that's a chumrah. So why don't we say like this? If an earthenware vessel, you can't make it impure by touching the outside, and yet the airspace, by just getting into the airspace inside, it will be impure. So all vessels that are mitame from the outside, wouldn't you think that the airspace inside should also make them impure? So they're going to say, Amar Kra, like we did with the paraduma. If you remember, how do we know it doesn't apply to the paraduma? Because by the egla rufa, it says just here and not anywhere else. We're going to do the same thing here. By the kli cheres, it says tocho. That was the pasuk we were darshaning before. Remember, we did the gzera shava. Tocho to tocho. So now they're going to say tocho. Tocho shel zeh velo tocho shel acher. The word tocho is made up of two words. Hatoch shelo, the inside of it. It usually is a word that we take to mean it and nothing else, meaning no other vessels. It meaning the kli cheres, which was the subject of the sentence. It's only going to be the inside of a kli cheres, not the inside of any other vessel. And from there we learn this halacha doesn't apply to other vessels. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Hani tocho hadarshinu. You already used those words for a drasha. We just had the gzera shava from one to the other. You can't do two drashot from one word. Well, the Gemara answers you can in certain cases. Arba'a tocho ktive. It says tocho 4 times. This is not really true. It says tocho twice. But as I told you, tocho is made up of 2 words. Toch shelo. So if it says tocho twice in the pasuk, we count that as 4. Okay? Tocho, toch, tocho, toch. Because each tocho is made up of a toch also. Okay? His toch, right? It's toch. So each time we're going to count that as 2, we get 4. So now we're going to have 4 drashot on this pasuk. Toch, so the first one is chal legufe. Okay? 1 is for the halacha itself. Which halacha? The one we started with today, which is even if the food isn't touching, right? As long as it's inside, even if it's not touching, the food is going to become impure if the vessel already contracted impurity. Chal gzera shava. The second one is to compare the sheretz going into the airspace to the food being in the airspace. The food doesn't need to be touching. The sheretz doesn't need to be touching. That's where we started today. The third is the one we just darshaned. This law of toch is only relevant for earthenware vessels, not for anything else. And now we have one new one, and because of this, I brought the cup that was taller than the other. Tocho velo toch tocho. Vafilu kli shetef. Okay, what does this mean? If I put a vessel in a vessel, okay, that's already toch tocho. That's not going to be included. I have a vessel inside another vessel, even a kli shetef. Let's talk about what that means. Kli shetef means it's a kli that can be rinsed off. What they mean by rinsed off, meaning it can be purified in a mikvah. Okay, metal, for example, can be purified in a mikvah. Earthenware, if you remember, we've learned, shviratan zohi taratan. The only way to purify it is to break it. Okay, if it stays whole, it can't ever be purified. So what they're saying is if you have any vessel inside another vessel, okay, which we'll talk about what this means in a minute, even if it's a metal vessel, okay, we'll talk about why even a metal, but the point is any vessel, it doesn't matter what, but even metal, and that's why I brought a metal one. If you have so if you can't see because you're listening and not watching, so I have a mug, and in my mug is sitting a taller kiddush cup. Okay, now, if in the mug we have a sheretz, let's say, okay, or a sheretz was in there, and inside that vessel, after the sheretz is in the mug, we put in another mug, another cup, this kiddush cup, which is taller than the mug. Okay. If it's shorter, this whole halacha is irrelevant. Because if the height of the silver goblet or whatever's inside it is lower, then everything everywhere that's within the air, it's all within the airspace of the kli, the earthenware vessel. Because anything, right, that goes below this line of the top of the earthenware vessel is going to be impure. So if I have food, let's say I have wine inside my kiddush cup, if it's shorter and it's underneath the line of the mug, anything inside this mug is going to be impure. It doesn't matter that I have a vessel inside a vessel. But if it is taller, which means that the tuma of the airspace in here, right, doesn't cover what's in the inner mug, in the inner cup, because the inner cup is higher, then this, basically anything in this kiddush cup is not impure, even though it's sitting inside an earthenware vessel that has a sheretz in it. And even though, and this is why it says even kli shetef, even though theoretically maybe the sheretz is touching the outside of the vessel, okay, but because the height of this is taller and it's toch tocho, that's this drasha. Only things that are in the vessel, not things that are in a vessel inside the vessel, that aren't within the airspace of the kli cheres because they're higher and taller. So anything in this kiddush cup is protected from impurity, will not become impure. That's the fourth halacha, okay? It's just a side halacha, but it's the fourth halacha we learned from here. We learned this, I believe, in Zvachim. I didn't check. Where does it come up? Yeah, in Zvachim Daf Gimel. This comes up, is that? Yeah. Okay. Now we're going to go to continue on. So let's just review. We proved that a kli cheres is not going to be b'tamei miggabbo from kal v'chomer. And that we learned because Ein samid patil alav, right? But if it had its samid patil, meaning it was covered completely, there would be no way for impurity to get in because touching the outside wouldn't work. Then we said maybe other vessels would be mitamei me'aviro, and we said we learned that from tocho. Then we had to get off on a whole tangent. Didn't we learn tocho for something else? Well, each word could be broken up, and therefore we end up with 4 drashot we can make. Then we get to one other question here. V'lo yu kol hakelim mitamim migaban ela mitochan u'b'negi'a mikal v'chomer. Maybe you would say all these other vessels, metal and other vessels, not earthenware. Maybe we say by touching the outside it doesn't work. Maybe it has to be in the airspace and touching. In other words, maybe only things that are inside the vessel are going to make it impure. Now, obviously not airspace. You would have to have it touching because we already proved that airspace is only for kli cheres. But maybe it would have to be mitochan, inside them, ubin nigi'ah, and by actually physically touching the vessel. From a kal v'chomer, what would the kal v'chomer be? Umach kli cheres shemitamei me'aviro eino mitamei miggabbo. If a kli cheres, that the airspace makes it impure, but it's not impure on the outside, wouldn't you then say, kol hakelim she'ein mitamei me'aviran eino din she'ein mitamei migabban? If these metal vessels and other kind of vessels aren't impure from the airspace, maybe then they shouldn't be impure from the outside either, just like a kli cheres isn't impure by touching the outside. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "V'chol kli patuach asher ein samid patil alav tamehu." Where did we learn this whole halacha? That it's not mitame on the outside, from the pasuk about the kli cheres, right? Any kli that patuach, right? Patuach we said meant kli cheres, and doesn't have a cover. If it had a cover, it wouldn't become impure. What's the drasha here? Haihu dechi ein samid patil alav tameh. Specifically here, where we're talking about a kli cheres, that was specifically what it was mentioned about. Hayesh samid patil alav, right? So that's where, and that's only in the first part of the pasuk where there's an earthenware vessel. That's when the second part is true. That only if it's open is it going to be impure. Hayesh samid patil alav, but then the inference would be if it does have a cover on it, tahor. Okay, but from there you learn kol hakelim, but other vessels that aren't included in this pasuk, this whole limitation doesn't apply to them. Ben sheyesh samid patil alehem, ben she'ein samid patil alehem mitamim. Because they're not referenced in this pasuk is basically saying kli cheres, it matters whether you have a cover or not. But everything else doesn't matter, otherwise it would have said so. So from that pasuk we learn it's just for kli cheres and not for anything else. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next comparison, still staying within the world of kelim, but a different issue entirely. Tahor b'kli eitz tamei b'kli matachot, tahor b'kli matachot tamei b'kli eitz. Okay, again we have a Mishna which doesn't tell us anything really. I mean, it tells us something, that we're comparing two things, wooden and metal vessels. There's a case that's impure for one and pure for the other, and there's a case that's the reverse. I'll remind you the rules about kelim becoming impure. Kelim, to become susceptible to impurity, they have to be useful, right? They have to be completed, I would say even. Not just useful, but complete. So, and it all depends a lot on the intent of the owner, what they were intending to make the vessel for. So if it's not complete, it's not yet susceptible to impurity. So now we're going to learn Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis learn, meaning we have a braita. Golmei kli eitz tmein. If I have a wooden vessel with a receptacle, meaning I can put something in it, but it's golmi. What does it mean, golmi? It's raw materials, meaning it's not complete. We're going to see all sorts of cases where something is not complete. It's still susceptible to impurity. And yet, pshutehem tahorim. If they don't have a receptacle and they're flat, like a piece of wood, okay, that's not susceptible to impurity because wood that's flat is not considered a vessel. Golmei klematachot tahorim. If I have something unfinished that's metal, it's not susceptible to impurity. But pshutehen tmeim. If I have a metal sheet, that is considered a vessel and that is susceptible to impurity. Nimtza tahor b'kli eitz tamei b'kli matachot, tahor b'kli matachot tamei b'kli eitz, just like all the other cases. What's tahor for one is tamei for the other. What's tahor for the other is tamei for the other. Okay, now we have to understand this. We don't yet know what is going on here. Okay, like why the difference. Okay, they're not going to actually focus on the pshutehen. Okay, the pshutehen are generally just known that only metal, flat things are used for things, and wood is just a piece of wood, really. If it's flat, it's just a piece of wood. It's not finished for anything at all, and therefore it's not susceptible to impurity. But we are going to talk about, right? So if you have a tray, that, like Rashi says, pshutehem by the wood, even nigmara kol malachtan, even if you've done everything you're supposed to do with it, it's just not susceptible to impurity. Okay, that's a basic law with wood versus metal. But now we're going to talk about this golmi issue. Now it's going to take us a little while till we finally understand the differences, but first let's understand what it means. What it means is unfinished. Unfinished in what way? I mean, unfinished can mean so many ways. So we're going to have a list, and then we're going to try to understand. We're going to have two explanations as to why the difference between metal and wood in unfinished vessels. So let's read. Tahor eluhen golmei kli eitz. Okay, if we're talking about the wood, and these are the ones that even if they're unfinished, they're still going to be susceptible to impurity. They're still considered a vessel already. Here's what we're talking about. So again, remember, you were talking about something that's like a bowl or something that has a receptacle. If it's flat, for sure not. But if it has a bowl, but kosha atid lashuf, you haven't yet smoothed it out, okay? Or lishabetz, you plan to put gems inside or some sort of adornment on it. Okay, ligarel, you intend to smooth it out or flatten it. This is like a more flattening to plain. Likarkev is to make grooves in it. Okay. Lahatiach betunis. Okay, this is interesting. This is most of the commentaries say a tunis is a tuna fish, and what we're talking about is they use the scales or the skin of a tuna fish to basically, I guess because of the scales, it's rough, to sand things down, okay, or to smooth it out, basically. Michusar ken o ogen o ozen, if it's missing a base or a rim or a handle, tameh. Okay, you have a wooden vessel that basically is missing some of the finishing touches. That's what we would call all these things, or a handle, or some of basically the finishing touches. It's already a vessel. Michusar chatita tahor, but if you haven't yet made that receptacle, okay, then it's tahor. So the Gemara says, okay, wait a minute. Bechusar chatita pshita. Obviously, if you didn't make the receptacle, then it's flat. Okay, what are we talking about here? Well, lo tzricha dechak kpiza bekaba. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about you made a receptacle, but your receptacle was a kapiza, which is 3 log. And you really intended to do a kav, which is 6 log. In other words, you started making your vessel, you made it deep, but you didn't make it as deep as you were planning. This is where I talked about intent is very important. If I intended to make something that could hold a whole log, and I only made it that was big enough for a half log, and I was still planning to hollow it out more to make it deeper, that's not a vessel, okay? That's not susceptible to impurity yet because it's unfinished. And that's what they meant by that last line, about the one case where it will still be not susceptible to impurity. Okay, Elohen golmei klei matachot is going to be very, very similar, other than the tunis, which is never used on. Okay, they wouldn't use the skin of a tuna on a metal implement, so that's the only change here. But the golmei klei matachot are kosha atid, turning out amabet, lashuf, again to smooth down, lishabetz, to put in gems or something else, adornments, ligarel, to plain, to likarker, which was to put in indentations, something like that, right? Grooves. Lahakish bekornos, to hammer it. That's the one difference here, because that's what you do with metal. You hammer it. Mechusal keno ogeno ozen, if it's missing the base, the rim, or the handle. Tahor. Okay, so it's all the same definitions, but the rule is the opposite. Mechusar kisoy, there's one exception to the rule. If it's just missing its cover, it's already tamei. Because then the vessel is a vessel. It's just missing the cover, but it still functions as a vessel. Okay, finally we get to, Mishna hani or Mishna hani. What's the difference between the two? Rabbi Yochanan amal, ho'il u'lechavod asuyim. Rabbi Yochanan says, because silver, now here's why show and tell is good, right? Look at my mug and look at my Kiddush cup, right? My Kiddush cup is much more beautiful, right? And you would never have a simple plain, right? You think about all your Kiddush cups. Anyone have a simple plain silver cup with nothing on it, right? It's very rare. It's got something on it, right? Mine has blue at the bottom. It's got pretty silver at the top, right? It's something is done to it. If you didn't put on in those, if you think about those the older style of Kiddush cups, right? There's always the etchings in them. Nobody has a Kiddush cup that's just plain with nothing on it. I don't know. Tell me if you have one, but generally they have something on them. So because they're done lechavod, they're done. You put out your silver as a to honor the table. That's why they're Kiddush cups, right? They're special utensils. So if you have one that's completely unfinished without the adornments on it, you wouldn't put it out. It would be completely disrespectful to have this plain silver, nothing on your table. So people don't use it if it's not finished. Whereas kli'ates aren't meant for kavod. They're useful, I would say, right? They're just, what's the word? They're practical, right? Okay, I need to put something in something, so I'll put it in. Okay, I didn't finish it. It doesn't have all those nice adornments on it. Still, a wooden tray, right? A wooden bowl, I'm going to use it because I need a bowl. Okay, but I wouldn't do that with my silver. Rav Nachman Amar, ho'ilu d'mehen yikarim. He says because they're expensive. If they're expensive, now, silver's a much more expensive item than wood. Because it costs money, so you're only going to sell it for a lot of money. No one's going to buy it if it's just plain silver. They're not going to buy it without the adornments. Whereas wood is so cheap, right? I was thinking you go to those dollar stores, right? You'll go to the dollar store, right? Or in Israel, I don't know, Muzalim. Okay, you go to that store, you'll buy a plain wooden vessel, wooden whatever, because you'll say, okay, it's cheap. So what? It doesn't have nice decorative on it, but you get what you pay for, right? And I'm willing to spend nothing on something that's not so nice looking. But I'm not going to buy silver for an expensive price if it's not finished. Okay, so there's two different reasons as to why silver unfinished is useless or not considered a vessel yet, and wood is considered a vessel. And again, once it's considered a vessel, it's susceptible to impurity. If it's not considered a vessel, it's not. So now we're going to say, my benayu. What's the difference whether you go with Rabbi Yochanan or you go with Rav Nachman? Ikabenayu klei etzem. Vessels made out of bones. Okay? Now, why? Well, bone is an expensive material, but people don't use them on their table for decorative elements in general. In other words, if it's unfinished, you would still put something bone that doesn't have the adornments on it, because they're not meant lekavod, but they are expensive. So if we go with the expensive, Rav Nachman, then we're going to say, oh, it's expensive. It's going to be like metal. If we go like Rabbi Yochanan, they're not asuyim lekavod. People don't put them on their fancy table to display, their fancy bone with all the decorative elements on it. So because of that, we would say it's like wood. Okay, I actually saw the psak, halacha is that it's like wood. We hold like Rabbi Yochanan. But now we're on Rav Nachman, who said it's because they're expensive. Va'azda Rav Nachman l'tameh, it fits in, he's consistent with his approach elsewhere. To Amar Rav Nachman, klei etzem keklei matachot amu. Okay, he basically says it explicitly, that bone vessels are like metal vessels. Michlal, now they just ask a side question, and then we'll get to the next Mishnah. This is just a total aside about the bone. Michlal de klei etzem mekabli tuma. You saying that bone vessels are susceptible to impurity? Now, why are they asking this as a question? Because in the Torah, it talks about what vessels are susceptible to impurity. And it mentions, I'll read you this pasuk we're going to read in a minute, in Bamidbar chapter 31, verse 20. This is in the battle with the Midianim, and they have these vessels they got from them. So it says, Kol beged v'chol kli or v'chol ma'aseh yizim v'chol kli eitz titchatau. It says you have to purify the vessels that you got from them. Which ones? a beged, clothing, kleor, anything leather, maseizim, something from goats, and wooden. Okay, so now you see, notice that bone is not mentioned there at all. So they say no, it is included. Where do you see it included? Titania, as we see in a braita, Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omel, right, this Rabbi Yishmael, who was the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, says, Ma tamud lomar v'choma aseizim titchatau. Why does it say v'choma aseizim? Theoretically, a goat, what's made from a goat? Really, it's from the hide, probably, which is mentioned already, kol kleor. So why are you mentioning goat again? So they say lahavi davar haba min ha'izim. It's to say something that comes from goats that's not the leather, which is min ha'karnayim or min ha'tlafayim, from the horns or from the hooves, which would be more like bone. Okay? Now, so that we're going to learn min ha'izim comes to teach you about bone. And now we're going to say shar behema v'chaya minayin. What about other animals? Because it's only izim, right? Then you would say, okay, only if you make from the horns of the goat, but not if you make something from the horns of a different animal. So how do we know? Obviously, those are included as well, because it says v'chol ma'aseh. If you notice, it's not so parallel on the pasuk. It says any beged, any kleor, and any ma'aseh izim. Why does it say ma'aseh izim? From there, they say any ma'aseh, anything you make from any other animals, horns or hooves, okay, or bones, so to speak. Okay, then they say, okay, wait a minute. In Cain, if it's going to say everyone's, not any animals, matamulomar izim. So why does it specifically say izim and not all animals? Prat la'ofot. They say they specifically chose izim to say specifically animals that are like izim, to exclude birds. Okay, if you take from the birds, from their, claws or something, and you make something out of that, I'm not sure exactly what material on the bird is similar, but it's not going to be susceptible to impurity. Okay, that was just a total aside, because the bones, if we go backwards and kind of review the sugya backwards, we're talking about, is bone susceptible to impurity, right? And how do we know that? And that was all because we said that vessels made from bones would be the nafkamina, the practical ramification, practical difference between Rav Nachman and Rav Yochanan about why silver vessels or metal vessels are not going to be susceptible to impurity if they're not complete, as opposed to wooden ones, which will be. And that's how we go back to, that was our Mishna, basically. Okay, new Mishna. Hachayav bishkedim hamarim patur b'metukim. We have two kinds of almonds. Some are very bitter and some are not. Okay, some are sweet. So the ones that are for the bitter ones, okay, the ones that are obligated in maaser, we're going to talk about this soon, in bitter ones are exempt. Are exempt in the sweet ones. And chayav b'metukim patur b'marim. The ones in the sweet ones that are obligated in maaser are exempt in the bitter ones. Okay, again, we have no idea what they're talking about. We're going to explain right now in the braita. Tanu Rabbanan, shkedim hamarim ktanim chayavim gdolim pturim. When you have these almonds that are small, that are very bitter, when they're small, they're not as bitter yet. The bigger they get, the more bitter they get. Once they're large, they're inedible. So once they're inedible, you don't have to tithe them because they're not food. You only have to tithe food. But when they're small, they're not as bitter yet, so you can still eat them, and therefore you have to tithe them. Mitukim gdolim chayavim ktanim pturim. And with the sweet ones, it's the exact opposite. When they're small, they're too small. Nobody eats them small. They wait till they get bigger, right? You'd rather they get bigger, you have something better to eat, and they get sweeter as they get bigger. So, because the process of, each one gets more sweeter, more bitter as it gets larger, so it's going to be the opposite for each of these almonds. But this is the one case so far that we've had in these Mishnayot where we're going to have a differing opinion that doesn't think there's a difference between the bitter and the sweet ones. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi Omer Mishum Aviv Zev Zev Liftor. Both are exempt. Okay, there's a difference of opinion. Both what? Okay, Rashi. We'll go with Rashi. Zev Zev Liftor. Rashi says Ktanim Pturim. The small ones are exempt. Bein Marim Bein Metukim. Because when they're small, right? Imagine if you have teeny lemons growing on your tree. They're barely grown yet. You're not obligated in maaser yet if you pick them because they're not really food yet. Any almonds in their small form are not really food yet. Okay, they're not ripe. They're not ready. In order for things to be obligated in maaser, they have to be ready. Even the bitter ones, they might taste a little better at that point, but they're really not good yet. Now, some people said that Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi wasn't talking about zev zev l'ftor. He was talking about zev zev l'chiyuv. Both the bitter ones and the sweet ones, they're both obligated to tithe them, even if they're large. Okay, we're going to have to explain. I thought we said they're inedible when they're large and they're bitter. So we're going to have to get back to that in a minute. But before we get there, Amar Rabbi Ila'a, Hora Rabbi Chanina b'tzipori, Kedivrei ha'omer zeveze liftor. So now, Rabbi Chanina and Tzipori ruled, number one, like Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, and according to the interpretation, that any small ones, even if they're the bitter ones that are actually somewhat edible when they're small, no one's obligated to tithe them because they're not really considered ready. But going back to the one that we just said we didn't really understand, but this will finish this Gemara on this Mishnah. What are the big ones used for that we're talking about tithing them? They're not edible. You can roast them with on the fire and make them sweet. So they might not be edible right now, but they can be made edible by roasting them. And because you can roast them and make them sweeter, therefore they can become edible, and therefore you're obligated to tithe them. Okay, so we ended up in this case with making this comparison and then stating there was actually a machloket about it, and in fact, somebody even held like the opposite opinion, and even within the machloket, right, we weren't sure what exactly Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka really said. Okay, whether both small, right, any small ones are not obligated or any large ones are obligated. Okay, new Mishnah. Now, we're going to talk about temed. The first thing I'll do is explain to you what temed is, and then I'm going to read Rashi with you because Rashi is very interesting here. Rashi takes a zoom-out approach, and I thought it was interesting to talk about in the context of all these Mishnayot we've been looking at, and he kind of says, how is this Mishnah different from all the others? So, temed, first we have to understand what temed is. There's actually a machloket what it is. It's water that we put in it, either grape pits, according to Rashi. According to Tosfot, it's grape dregs. Okay? But basically, you put something in there. It's not like the best way to make wine, but you put something of grapes in this water, and over time, it ferments, and it tastes like wine. Okay, it becomes like wine. So the question here is going to be, at what stage is it considered still water, and at what stage is it considered wine? Okay, and then there's ramifications for various things. We're going to read all that in Rashi. Rashi's going to give us some background, but before he gives us background, like I said, he takes a zoom-out approach and discusses what's a little different about this Mishnah than the others. So I'm going to read Rashi, starting from where it says Mishna hatemed. It's actually, in my Gemara, it's the same line in Rashi as we are in the Mishnah. Hatemed ad shelo ichmitz. Okay, it's going to be until we're going to basically differentiate between temed before it ferments and after it ferments. So right before it kind of tastes like wine, and after it does. Hanami lahachi tanya hachi. Okay, this is mentioned in the slew of Mishnayot here. Mishum didanya lahanach delael. It's similar to the others. Ela. But it's different in one way, because we're going to have how it's going to be similar, what's true for one is not true for the other, etc. But until now we've been talking about two different things, two different types of almonds, two different types of vessels, okay, two different types of things, and what's true for one is not true for the other. Here we're talking about one thing, temed. But yesh b'chiluk prakim, but there's different stages in time. Okay, so Rashi says it nicely. We're talking about here one item, but at different stages. So that's just a different conceptual, a conceptual difference between this Mishnah and the others. Then if you skip down a few lines, Rashi starts telling us what the issue is, whether it's wine or whether it's water, what the ramifications. So we'll read it in Rashi, give us background. Yayin huzkar linyan kichat ma'asir b'Yerushalayim. If you remember, it says you're supposed to bring your kesef maaser sheni, you take your maaser sheni produce, you could bring it to Jerusalem and eat it there, but instead of schlepping all that stuff, you could also just redeem it onto a coin, take the coin with you to Jerusalem and buy with it food. What kind of food? Well, it has certain criteria. And one of the things it can't be is water, okay? Can't be water, it can't be wine, okay? It can be something that grew from the ground, you could also buy sacrifices with it, but the point being, it has to be something, has to fit into a category of one of these items, and water is not one of them. So if it's water, this temed is considered water still, then you won't be able to buy temed with your maaser sheni money in Jerusalem. The second issue is, if it's water, I'm skipping down a drop in Rashi, mayim who's karuli inyan lifsol et mikvah. Water that's collected is not allowed to be used in a mikvah. If you pour some water into a mikveh that's not good water, it's not going to ruin your mikveh. But if your mikveh it's short. I'm not going to read this in Rashi, I'm just going to tell you outside. If it doesn't have the 40 se'ah, which is the minimum required measurement, and you pour 3 log of collected water, right? Remember, it has to be, right? There's certain waters that a mikveh can be made from. without getting into that now, but it can't be water that was collected in a vessel. So if you take this temed and we treat it as water, then it's going to, if it's 3 log, and the mikveh doesn't have enough water in it, it's going to ruin your mikveh. What does it mean ruin it? It means even if later you put proper water in the mikveh water, okay, like rainwater, and you put rainwater in your mikveh, well, and you get up to your 40 se'ah proper mikveh water, it doesn't matter because you already ruined your mikveh by putting that 3 log of water in. But if it's wine doesn't ruin a mikveh. Only collected water, not wine. So that's going to be the nafkamina if it's wine or water. So now let's go to the Mishnah. It should be fairly straightforward at this point. Hatemed ad shelo ichmitz, if it hasn't yet fermented, eino nikach bekesef masir. You can't use the kesef masir to buy it because we view this as water. Basically, it's going to say until it ferments, it's considered water. After it ferments, it's considered wine. Uposel et mikvah. Now, at this early stage, it's going to ruin a mikvah if you pour 3 log into a mikvah that's missing the 40, doesn't have 40 se'ah. Mishe ichmitz, once it becomes fermented, nikach bekesef masir, it's now wine, so you can buy masir, you take your masir money and buy temed with it, ve'ino posel ta mikvah, and it won't ruin a mikvah. Okay, that's halacha 1. Halacha 2, 2 brothers who inherit their father's property. They can be partners in 2 different ways. They can either keep the estate of the father whole and share it, and then they're partners, or they could divide the Yerusha into 2, and then decide, we want to be partners. Those are 2 different kind of partnership agreements. Because in the first arrangement, they're really like one. Because it was one, okay, that they're just sharing the ownership of their father's estate. Okay, the way we would call it. It's their father's estate. So they're just partners in their father's estate. But that is really like one person there because it's really the father's estate. If they separated the father's estate, they each got the money, and then they decided to go as partners into something, then they're called partners. That's 2 people that are now partners. This has ramifications for 2 different things. You'll never have to tithe animals there's a special drasha that says there's no obligation of tithing animals, which is you would take the 10th and it would have to be brought as a sacrifice. No obligation to do that if you're partners. It's only for individuals. So if we treat the estate as an individual and they're partners in the individual estate, there's no obligation. There is an obligation to tithe. If they're viewed as 2 partners who came together and decided to be partners in money and they own animals together, it won't be obligated to tithe. The second issue is the machatzita shekel. When you bring a half shekel together with someone else and you bring 1 shekel, each one has to add a kalbon. It's like a commission fee. Okay? But if they're one and they're both paying the 1 shekel together because they're taking it from their father's estate, then they don't have to pay a kalbon each. So that's going to be the nafkamina here. 2 brothers that are partners. If they're partners in such a way that they'd have to be obligated in the kalbon because they're treated as 2 individuals that came together in a partnership agreement and paid the machatzita shekel together, then they're going to have to, right, if they pay the machatzita shekel together, they're going to have to each pay a kalbon. But they're p'turim b'masir behema because there's no tithing for partners who jointly own an animal. But if it's from the estate of the father and there's an obligation of the masir behema, they're going to be exempt from the kalbon because they're like one person paying a whole shekel, and then you don't have to do the kalbon. So, mani matnitin lo Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbanan. Now, the Gemara says, wait a minute, this thing about the masir doesn't match either opinion in Rabbi Yehuda or the rabbis in a Mishnah in masir, in maschot. Ditanya. It should be ditnan, because it says in the Mishnah, hamitamed, if you made temed. Now, the main thing before we get here is, what's the distinction in our Mishnah? It's a matter of time. Did it ferment? Did it not ferment? But according to this Mishnah, that's not the issue. If you made temed and then you measured it after you made the temed, you, drained out the dregs. And after you did that, you found you have the exact same amount. No volume changed at all. Patur, you're exempt from maser. This isn't wine. If there was no change in the volume after you made this, then it's basically what it was before. It was water before, it's water now. Okay? It's like fruit juice kind of thing, right? But it's not wine. And it's not even, right? Because you're not chayv maser on water. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev. Rabbi Yehuda obligates. Okay? Now, mani. Rabbanan afagav diachmitz. Rabbi Yehuda afagav dilo achmitz. Notice, Rabbi Yehuda obligates, the rabbis exempt. One views it as water, one views it as wine. But there's absolutely nothing to do with did it ferment or not ferment. That's not even an issue in this Mishnah. So this Mishnah, at first glance looks like it completely doesn't go, neither opinion there seems to match our Mishnah. It doesn't make sense that there'd be a Mishnah Mazchot and a Machloket, and neither, our Mishnah doesn't reflect either one of those opinions, because neither of them said that the issue was, did it ferment? Okay, with that we finished our daf, and we'll get back to this question tomorrow. So what we started with was the issue, right, the different issues of the airspace versus the getting tamei from touching the outside of the vessel. Where did we get that each one has those unique laws? And we learned from all these different drashot on the psukim, mainly, this tocho and all that, and also the kli patuach asher ein sami patil alav. Okay, those were our drashot mainly on that section. Then we got to tahor b'kli eitz tamei b'kli matachot. The unfinished of the kli eitz is considered finished, whereas the unfinished of a matechet is not. We had two reasons why that was, and we talked about the difference, the nafkamina, which was the vessels made out of bone. Then we got to the two types of almonds, and there we actually had a machloket where maybe it's not true that what's true for one is not true for the other. Maybe they really are the same, and in fact, it seems like the ruling was that way, although it was unclear in what way do they view the same, the small ones or the big ones. And then we moved to the temed, where the issue is there it's a matter of time, that it changes over time. Is it wine? Is it water? Ramifications being for Maser Sheni. Can you buy your Maser Sheni money, use it to buy it only if it's wine? And does it disqualify a mikvah, which would only be water? And at what stage? Then we said this doesn't seem to match any Tanaitic opinion. Plus, in that Mishnah, we had this other case about the partners and whether they're viewed as one or whether they're viewed as two people who are partners, and that is ramifications for Maser Behema, where you don't have to tie things that are partnership agreements, but if it's one owner, like the father's estate, you would. And the issue of the kalbon, which you only have to pay that extra kalbon per person if you're coming in as two people, bringing them shekel together. If it's one person's kind of doing it as their father, then they wouldn't have to bring the kalbon. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day.